This is Old Mountain Media.
No matter how far, no matter wherever you are, I'm with you. Deep in your heart, my love, I'll stay when I'm away. No matter how far, no matter the way, no matter the pain and heartache, I promise all of those lonesome nights apart, you'll be back in my arms, no matter the way.
It's 1924. Picture yourself aboard a small boat, a fishing boat, gently floating in a calm harbor off the Pacific Ocean deep within the western Canadian coastline. The fog covers the water like a thick blanket, and you have finally found the perfect spot to cast your nets in the salmon arm branch of the Sasquatch Inlet. Two of your crew work the deck while you try your hardest to keep warm in a small captain's bridge, just big enough for one, maybe two people. You take a sip of your rich coffee, a bit bitter, and smile as you picture yourself hoisting in full nets. It's been a tough season, but you have hope in your heart, and the warm coffee, despite the bitterness, lifts your spirit. As you glance at the shore, you suddenly notice a lone person stumbling out of the trees on the shoreline. The person begins waving you down, looking panicked and weary.
Hey guys, you see that person on the shore? What the hell is he doing way out here alone? Must be lost or stranded. Should we help him?
You hoist your nets and head toward the shore where the figure stands, its dark silhouette standing out against the white fog surrounding it. As you pull closer, you see a man, disheveled and weary.
Are you okay?
You shout out to the man. He doesn't answer, but falls down to his knees with his arms raised out in front of him. Who is he? What's he doing out here alone? Little do you know that his story will be one that will haunt your dreams, and will have you thinking twice before bringing your boat to this inlet ever again. This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. Have you ever felt like you're in a tunnel? The sides are closing in on you. You're unable to escape the overwhelming feelings of unhappiness, anger, worry, or fear. Without a healthy mind, being truly happy and at peace is hard. The good news is, therapy works. It's time to stop being ashamed of normal human struggles and start feeling better, because you deserve to be happy. BetterHelp is customized online therapy that offers video, phone, and even live chat sessions with your therapist. Join the millions of people who are seeing what online therapy is really about. It's always a good time to invest in yourself because you are your greatest asset. And here's a special offer for listeners of Something Cryptid This Way Comes. You can get 10% off your first month of professional therapy at betterhelp.com/PNW. That's betterhelp.com/PNW. Thanks again to BetterHelp for sponsoring this podcast.
Pacific Northwest Sasquatch Shadows presents Something Cryptid This Way Comes.
In the majestic mountains and regal forests of British Columbia, Canada, east of Vancouver Island and off the Pacific Ocean, there lies a vast land rich with cedar, hemlock, pine, and other evergreen trees that reach to the skies. It's 1924, and Albert Ostman is taking a short break from his full-time job as a logger and a construction worker. He had heard the area was full of gold and was ready to do a bit of prospecting, as was the common hobby of the wilderness during the turn of the century. Men and women had found their fortunes in these hills, and Albert was ready to find his. But according to his own account of that hot summer in the northern Cascade Mountains, what he found was much more valuable and much more haunting. Albert decided to head to the Toba Inlet, north of the booming town of Vancouver and northeast of West Redonda Island. In these hills, or rather mountains, one could get lost very easily, and such was the case for Albert. But he claims he was not lost due to his own making. Rather, he was taken in the night, after being stalked for 3 days by an unknown creature, one that seemed more curious about him than he of it. As he made his way on the Union steamship to the small town of Lund, he looked around and thought to himself,
"Surely this is the land of riches. Gold is waiting just for me."
He had his rifle, a small backpack and sundries, and was ready to head into the unknown. When he arrived at Lund, he knew he would need help to get to the Toba Inlet, and he found a First Nations member of the Tla Amin tribe, on whose land the small village of Lund had been erected. The guide told Albert stories of an unknown hairy figure that supposedly killed visitors to the forest.
"The man of great repute, but a heavy drinker, would go for days into the wilderness, these trees." Why? He claimed he knew where every hidden treasure was beneath the ground, gold, a metal that is valuable to the white man. He would travel into the woods, return with a bag of gold, trade it for whiskey, spend all of his treasure, and then leave again. On one trip to get more gold from a mine he claimed to own, he never returned. Some say a hairy beast killed him. Not a bear, not any other animal from the trees. It was the large man, the ancient man, the pure human. What do they look like? They have hair all over their bodies, but they are not animals. They are people, my ancestors. Big people living in the mountains. My uncle saw the tracks of one that were 2 feet long. His friend saw one over 8 feet tall. Sounds like a load of malarkey to me. I don't believe in your fables about mountain giants. Maybe 1,000 years ago they were here, but not nowadays.
The guide stared at Albert for a moment, gently shook his head as if he was not surprised by Albert's response, and kept walking. They finally arrived at the Toba Inlet in the late afternoon, and the sun was starting to fade in the west, illuminating the skies with the colors of fire fading to a royal purple in the east. The two travelers shared a meal, and Albert told his guide to look out for him in 3 weeks' time.
I'll be camping right here, so come back in 3 weeks. I'll make it worth your while.
The guide set off, and Albert was alone in the shadows of the trees. He set up camp, lit a small fire, and listened to the sounds around him, crickets and owls accompanied by the song of the soft breeze. He couldn't imagine a more peaceful place to be, and yet the story his guide had told him haunted his thoughts. Was he alone out here? Was he just convincing himself that the mountain giants were no longer in the area to make himself feel more safe? He finally crawled into his sleeping bag, his rifle by his side, and did his best to shove the thoughts out of his mind. At last, he slept. The next days were uneventful. Albert spent them leaving his base camp to explore the surrounding area. He would pack up some of the food he had purchased from a small shop in Lund and return each night to rest. After a few days, he decided to pack more and head further into the wilderness. He loaded his pack with bacon, a bag of beans, prunes, biscuits, cheese, and pancake flour. He also made sure to pack his beloved tobacco, 4 tins worth. He heaved his 80-pound pack onto his back with his rolled-up sleeping bag attached, grabbed his Winchester rifle and his prospecting pickaxe. He strapped his hunting knife to his belt and set off into the darkness of the looming shadows around him. The forest invited him in like a temptress of the night, daring him to join on a forbidden journey. After a few hours, thirst overcame him. His mouth was as dry as a sand-blown desert. His brow was as wet as a cloth drenched in the salty sea. So he stopped at an area about 1,000 feet above sea level and looked out over the surrounding islands and the various inlets. He found a damp spot on the ground and began to dig for water, finally striking wet soil and smearing the moist dirt on his face and neck.
This is the perfect place to set up a new camp. If I set out from here, I'm sure to find gold nearby. I've got a good feeling about this place.
He set up camp for the night. The breeze gently kissed his face with innocent relief, and as he woke the next morning, he felt refreshed. He scouted the area, and later that afternoon decided to head back down the hillside the following morning. As he broke camp, he felt a sudden awareness of being watched. He swung around, but nothing was there. He set off for a 3-hour hike before he stopped once more for the night, setting up camp near a water spring. He was now at least 20 miles into the deep wilderness away from his first base camp, and the stillness on the air served as a constant reminder of his solitude. Shadows creeped toward him from every direction, guiding him toward the next turn, the next valley, the next hill, the next hope for gold. After 2 days of solid hiking with small breaks throughout the night, Albert decided it was time to set up a more permanent campsite. He had seen a bit of yellow below some small trees, and his eyes told him gold was waiting nearby, just for him. Surrounded by big black hemlock trees, he felt at peace and was content with his new home away from home. He settled in for the night. He thought of himself as a heavy sleeper. Not much disturbed him or brought him out of sweet repose, particularly when he slept contentedly. But that night, things began to happen. He woke from his deep slumber to notice that some of his things had been disturbed during the dark hours. His pack had been moved. His small pot and pan for cooking had been turned upside down, but nothing was missing, nothing that he could see. He spent the next day digging in various areas near his camp and hunting for small game. He was craving meat. He shot a small grouse and brought it back to his camp to clean and cook it over his small fire. The small brown feathers with black tips were difficult to pluck, but finally, after gutting the bird, he had a meal that was rich on the air. His mouth watered as he sank his teeth into the tender meat. A rustling sound came from behind him.
Must be a few birds. Hey, I'm eating your friend. Better stay away.
The savory meat had lifted his spirits, and his dark sense of humor came back in full force.
Careful now. Don't make me come and get you. I'm still hungry.
He stared at the place where the bushes rustled, but nothing emerged. He shrugged his shoulders, turned back to his fire, and continued his meal fit for a king. After another peaceful night, Albert woke to find his pack had been completely emptied out. Something, or someone, had turned the pack upside down. He had hung it on a pole the evening before to keep it out of a bear's reach, but something had gotten to it.
What? Where are my prunes? Hey, you took my prunes!
He yelled out to the shadows, but nothing answered back.
Must be those damn porcupines. I hate those spiky little porkies. Little camp robbers is what they are. But how did they get up to my pack?
He climbed up onto a big rock and observed his camp from afar. Nothing showed up. He hoped it would be a porcupine, as they make a flavorful stew. He spent the day walking around his camp, looking for signs from intruders, but found nothing.
What would steal from me, but not leave a print of some kind?
A vision of a large, hairy human flashed at his mind. He shook the vision from his thoughts and settled down for the night, placing his gun inside his sleeping bag next to him, along with a few comforts to calm his spirit. The tobacco tins were a welcome reassurance of familiarity in this vast, uncharted wilderness.
I'm staying awake tonight. There is no way I'll be robbed again.
But he fell asleep. In the early hours of the morning, just past the midnight hour when darkness steals color and nightmares flood the mind, Albert woke to something that shook him, both inside and out. He couldn't feel the coolness of the earth below him, the steadfast support of the ground anchoring him to a spot. He was being carried. He was half asleep and forgot where he was, as one often does when pulled out of slumber. But as he gathered his wits and pulled himself completely out of unconsciousness, he knew he was in trouble. He felt his sleeping bag around him, his rifle by his side, and the boots he had stowed at the bottom of his sleeping bag. His knife was poking into his side, sheathed and at the ready for use. At first, he thought he was sliding down the side of a mountain, carried away by a snowslide, but there was no snow around his camp, so it couldn't be that. Then he considered the possibility of being carried on horseback, but again, he had no horse with him, and the absence of a galloping motion brought him to the conclusion that something was holding him tightly. 1, 2, 1, 2. Slow and steady footsteps of some two-footed creature had collected him, carrying him off for what he felt would be his ultimate doom. He tried to reason with himself, considering what had abducted him in his sleep.
It can't be a bear, and I'm in a sitting position, so it must be carrying me with two arms. What walks on its hind feet and uses its front feet to hold things?
And that's when he remembered the old guide's tale of the mountain giants. His stomach dropped, his body trembled, and his heart raced 100 miles per hour. His head was inside his sleeping bag, and he knew he needed a better view of what this being, this thing, could be. He reached for his knife to cut a hole in his sleeping bag, but it was stuck underneath him. His rifle was on top of him, but he couldn't get any kind of angle on it worthy of taking any kind of shot. He gripped it tightly in both hands as if it was the one thing that might save him, but only when it gave him permission. He was at the mercy of his rifle. After what seemed an hour, Albert felt himself being carried up a steep hill. He had kept his mouth silent, and he had played dead, hoping the creature would lose interest and drop him on the ground. It did not lose interest. He could hear heavy breathing and an occasional coughing sound, much too human to cause him any sense of comfort, but then again, nothing in this situation could do that. He knew what had him. He knew what held his fate in its giant hands. A Sasquatch. Albert's legs started to go numb. He couldn't move for fear of alerting the Sasquatch to his alertness. One of the boots in the bottom of his sleeping bag was poking the bottom of his foot, causing excruciating pain, but he could not adjust his posture. It was a pain he'd have to deal with. Visions of his death flashed before his eyes.
Forget the boot, he thought to himself. You've got worse things to worry about, like living.
The ground leveled out, and he felt a thump. The creature had dropped the sleeping bag and started to drag him across the ground. His head snapped back and forth, and his legs ached with the pain of 1,000 stabbing knives. It was hot inside his cocoon. He imagined the person dragging a heavy bag of potatoes across the ground. That is surely what he was, this creature's next meal.
When are we going to stop? I can't take this much longer,
he thought to himself. His back was in full spasm mode, and his lungs burned from the putrid scent on the air. The scent of sweaty feet combined with rotten fruit stung his nostrils. Finally, they stopped. He hit the ground. The creature had dropped him, and all he could hear was heavy breathing. Wet, guttural sounds filled his ears, and then he heard something strange that he knew could not be of this world, at least, not the world he knew. Voices. Voices in the dark, starting to chatter, back and forth, from side to side. It was a language that he could not place, like a chanting sound combined with anger and confusion. He started to roll downhill as he had been dropped on a slope and was able to surface from the innards of his sleeping bag. The sky was black, and the moon was below the horizon. He moved about, determined to bring life back to his sleeping legs and put on his boots. He stopped struggling and listened again. There had to be at least 4 creatures. He heard voices from all directions. They were standing around him having some sort of discussion. He had never heard of Sasquatch before the guide told him the stories, but now he was certain. He had been abducted. Albert was overwhelmed by what he saw and what he heard. He began to plan an escape. How would he get away from these creatures? How would he survive? And then, a morbid thought entered his mind.
How will I taste to them?
He quickly shoved that thought out of his mind. There was no point in focusing on the darkness of his situation. He needed a plan. The black of night began to lighten, and the gray, white, and blacks were becoming greens, blues, and purples. The coming morning was upon them, and he focused on the 4 Sasquatch around him. He struggled out of his sleeping bag, held steadfast to his gun, and faced his captors.
What you fellas want with me?
The light had released the shadows that shrouded their faces, and he could finally make out more details. 2 of the Sasquatch were large, at least 8 feet tall. The other 2 were between 4 and 5 feet tall.
They must be kids, young'uns. This is a family,
he thought to himself. They were covered in hair with no clothes of any kind covering their massive bodies. Albert quickly glanced at his watch.
4:25 a.m. Light enough to get the hell out of here.
He looked back at the family. The young one seemed scared of him, like he was a threat. The old man and old lady, as he would later call them, kept chattering and presumably were comforting their offspring. The old lady seemed frustrated and sounded like she was yelling at her mate. The old man was waving his arms about, like a Protestant preacher from the south, threatening his congregation with fire and brimstone, should they not turn from their wicked ways. Suddenly, the family of giants left them. He was alone, surrounded by only the shadows of early morning light and the lingering scent of the creatures. He gagged. His stomach lurched. He choked on spit. He hadn't eaten for at least 16 hours, and there was nothing in his stomach. Albert tried to gather his bearings, took out his compass, which was stringed around his neck, and in the early light squinted to see what direction he was facing. The sun had not risen enough to give him a solid clue as to what direction he was looking. He noticed a large V-shape opening nearby in the rock, and there sat the old man, staring at him, its head tilted to the side as if it was contemplating its next move. He slowly took out the tins of food that he had stored in his sleeping bag, keeping a careful watch on the family patriarch, who continued to stare with a blank but evil look in its eyes. The eyes.
They look human,
Albert thought to himself.
Maybe the old guide was right. Maybe this is an ancient people.
We live in a world of mystery, and mostly from questions within ourselves. Pride Counseling is affordable, private online counseling for the LGBTQIA+ community. You can get access to licensed, trained, fully accredited counselors and therapists, and if you can't afford counseling, there is financial aid available that you can apply for. You get unlimited 24/7 messaging with your counselor, meaning you're connected with a counselor the entire time via your phone or computer. With Pride Counseling, you can connect with an LGBTQIA+ counselor from anywhere. And as a special offer to listeners of Something Cryptid This Way Comes, you can get 10% off your first month of professional therapy at pridecounseling.com/PNWpod. That's PNWPOD. Again, that link is pridecounseling.com/PNWpod. Thank you to Pride Counseling for sponsoring this podcast. He began to plot his escape in his mind. Why he didn't load his rifle and shoot his captors, he'll never know. Even later in his life, he questioned why he chose not to shoot his way out of his captivity. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the eyes. Perhaps it was the fact that these things, these Sasquatch, looked like some sort of bizarre human. He couldn't shoot a human. He emptied more of his items out from his sleeping bag. Milk, biscuits, a can of coffee. But the prunes, those prunes were gone. So was the pancake mix. And what worried him the most, his rifle ammunition was missing. It was as if the creatures knew what their purpose was and took them away for their own safety. Albert looked to his left and saw out of the corner of his eye 2 conical-shaped heads peeking out from behind a bush. It was the children, the Sasquatch children. They immediately ducked out of sight behind a juniper bush when he looked at them, and then slowly lifted their heads back into view whispering to each other. He felt like a rabbit in a cage, being looked at before being taken out and played with.
I'll not be their damned plaything,
he thought to himself.
I gotta get out of here.
The two children kept whispering to one another. He didn't know why, but he assumed they were brother and sister. Humanizing them was making this easier, as if he'd have a chance to reason with his kidnappers, appeal to their human side.
Hey there. Hey, it's okay.
They ducked out of sight again. Chatter quietly rose from behind the bush. Albert felt safe enough to move about, but he knew any sense of escape would only lead to his capture again, and that his safety would surely end were he to be caught a second time. He sat quietly and became determined to act as if he was living with the family, not as their pet, but as a member of their clan. He stood up, carried his rifle and the emptied coffee can at his side, and set off to look for water.
I'll come back,
he promised the old man. It grunted and tilted its head in the opposite direction, continuing to stare. Albert slowly made his way to a nearby spring, gathering some water. He made his way back to the opening. The old man was gone. He entered the opening and noticed a hard and dry floor covered with leaves, dry moss, and pine needles, as if they had been placed there.
This must be their home.
The crevice between the tall rocks was dark, and the air was dense, heavy and humid. He noticed what looked like blankets woven out of cedar bark. They looked inviting, and he couldn't help but admire the craftsmanship these creatures displayed. He sat down, his back to the wall, and closed his eyes. The four entered the area, sat down opposite of him, and watched. Albert grabbed some of his food and ate it cold. The young male seemed curious and slowly approached him. Albert reached down and grabbed his empty snuff box. He then lightly tossed it to the curious creature, and it immediately sprang towards the box and snatched it before it hit the ground. It took the small box over to its sister, and they sat in awe of the item, closing it with loud snaps of metal hitting metal. Open, close, open, close. This went on for what seemed an hour. Finally, the girl took it over to the old man, who took it in his hand. The five sat in the area all night, staring at each other. Through the darkness, Albert could just make out their silhouettes. He was determined to flee the next day. He had to escape. He had to make a run for it. The following day, after he had woken from half-sleep, Albert noticed the old lady was gone. He grabbed his things, quickly picked up his rifle, and started to walk towards the opening of the area. The old man jumped in front of him and held out his hand, signaling that Albert wasn't going anywhere. The language still meant nothing to Albert, but he assumed this either meant no or stay. Albert somehow made it back to his makeshift campsite next to the area, under the watchful eye of the old man, and thought that shooting his way out would only cause more problems. His hunting rifle would not stop these creatures.
There has to be a better way than killing him. Maybe if I can befriend the youngins, or the tobacco. Maybe I can blind them with tobacco.
Later, the old lady appeared with arms full of grass, twigs, spruce, and hemlock branches, as well as some kind of nut that grew in the ground. Albert recognized them from what he had seen on Vancouver Island. Was she bringing him gifts? The young male brought him some sweetgrass, and Albert returned the favor with another tin of tobacco, this time with the sweet, dried plant still inside. The brother took the tin, sniffed it, and let out a huff, and then carried it to the old man. The brother and the old man had some sort of conversation. The brother came back and asked for a second tin. Albert gave it to him with great trepidation, and the brother took it to his sister. Albert took out a third tin and shoved a pinch of tobacco into his mouth.
That's so good.
The brother pointed at the old man and motioned for him to give his father some of the snuff. Albert shook his head and motioned for the old man to come to him. But to his chagrin, the old man just watched from a distance. This went on over and over. A few days passed. Albert and the young members of the family continued in this game, sharing tobacco and watching each other.
If I could just get the old man to come over to me, get him to eat a full box of snuff, that would kill him for sure. And that way he kills himself. Then I won't be guilty of murder. These are surely some type of human.
Finally, after a few more days, the old man relented. He came over and grabbed the snuff box and emptied the entirety of the contents into its mouth. The old lady followed suit, and the children did the same. Huge, heaping mouthfuls of tobacco. The old man licked what was left of the tin. Albert knew it was time to make his escape. He fired his rifle above the wall that was nearest the old lady. She screamed at him, as if she had seen a rifle before and knew exactly what he had. Just then, the four Sasquatch started to retch. The tobacco had caused them to be sick. The sound of retching and the stench of fresh vomit filled the air. Albert knew this was his chance. He grabbed as many of his personal items as he could, and he ran faster than he had ever run before. He could hear yelling in the background. The creatures, they were chasing him, and their screaming shook his bones. The throbbing of his pulse caused searing pain to light his temples on fire. After a few hours, he came to a creek at the bottom of a canyon. As he glanced behind him, he saw that he was not being followed. Maybe the tobacco did the trick. Then again, maybe they were still following at a distance. He kept running, looking to the horizon.
If I could just make it over that hill.
As soon as he climbed a hill and dropped into its valley, another hill met him with a taunting landscape that caused his lungs to scream. His muscles ached, his back cramped, his mouth was bone dry. If the Sasquatch family didn't catch him, these hills would be his executioner for defiling their sanctity and purity. He vowed to himself that he'd never dig another hole as long as he survived. Suddenly, he heard an engine echoing off the canyon walls. He was safe. He approached a group of loggers, telling them he was a prospector, but determined not to tell them what he had just survived. Surely they would think him a wandering fool. He made his way back to another inlet on the ocean called the Sitchelt, near the Salmon Arm branch of water, where he saw a lone fishing boat, waved it down, and boarded it to head back to the nearest town. He was safe. For now. And he was alive, although he knew he would never forget being held captive by four ghostly beings in the wilderness. Albert Ostman waited 50 years to tell his story. The author John Green published Albert's story in the book Sasquatch, The Apes Among Us, available where fine books are sold. Many say Albert was lying, that his story is too detailed to make any sense, that he couldn't find gold, so he made the story up for fortune and for fame. But I ask you this, if fortune and fame is the end goal, then wouldn't one choose a topic of less controversy and more hard proof? Was Albert lying? We will never know, but I ask this of you. Will your need for solid proof deny you the opportunity to consider what might actually be out there? Waiting for us? Watching us? Thinking about us? According to Albert, he spent time living with the mountain giants. And just until the point of his near-death experience, he had doubt in his mind. You will never know the definite truth. Consider the unknown. Challenge your doubts. Thank you for listening to this retelling of the 1924 tale of Albert Ostman's abduction. Special thanks to Bigfoot Encounters, John Green, and the First Nations people of the Tla Anim tribe of British Columbia. Dialogue used in this short story is created from the events of 1924 as recalled by Mr. Ostman, and is not necessarily accurate, but is based on extensive research and multiple retellings by Albert himself. To read an extended version of the story, look for Green's book, Sasquatch, The Apes Among Us. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a 5-star rating and a review, which will help these stories get out there. And again, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. And visit us on Instagram at PNW Sasquatch Shadows. Help spread the word and reach out and say hello. Something Cryptid This Way Comes is part of the Old Mountain Media family of podcasts and is written, produced, and sound engineered by me, Dr. Russ, of Pacific Northwest Sasquatch Shadows. Coming this fall, a new podcast with extended stories will make its debut, Legends and Tales of the Pacific Northwest. This storytelling format will reveal legends and tales of adventure and mystery, many of which are not commonly known. And stay tuned for tales of invention, discovery, mayhem, and even a touch of murder. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to always keep your wits about you. And maybe a tin of tobacco. Nah, you don't need that.
Please, oh please, won't you stick around? I don't wanna say goodbye when the sun goes down. I wanna keep you close, wanna hold you tight. I don't ever wanna say goodnight, won't you stick around? An hour or two will never be enough to be with you. Whenever you leave me longing and blue. Please, oh please, won't you stick around? Spare just a little time, don't go running round. I wanna keep you close, wanna hold you tight. I don't ever wanna say goodnight, won't you stick around? Well, if you leave, don't leave it oh so long. Come on back where you know you belong. When we're apart, how I long for you. You stole my heart, don't you ever say we're through. Please, oh please, won't you stick around? Spare just a little time, don't go running round. I wanna keep you close, wanna hold you tight. I don't ever wanna say goodnight, stick around. will never be enough to be with you. Whenever you leave me longing and blue. Please, oh please, won't you stick around? I don't wanna say goodbye when the sun goes down. I wanna keep you close, wanna hold you tight. I don't ever wanna say goodnight, but just stick around.
Something Cryptid This Way Comes is a production of Old Mountain Media. Visit us on Instagram at PNW Sasquatch Shadows and Facebook at Old Mountain Media.
Something cryptid this way comes.